Hey everybody, welcome back to Sec 110. Mr. Armke here with you for Chapter 6 today, Network Security Devices, Design, and Technology. Our objectives are threefold. We're going to look at the different types of network security devices and how they're used. We're going to look at secure network architectures and describe them, and explain how network technologies can enhance security. Now, security through network devices talks about the idea that security can be achieved using features found in standard devices. Configuration is key. If you have them set up out of box, then obviously those are easily cracked. The defaults are never what we want to use. So if we go in and make the customizations necessary to tailor it to our particular situation, we are often going to have a much better result. This also involves including hardware that is specifically designed for security or designed primarily for security. So things like smart switches and routers and things like that, stuff that has extra technology in order to improve its functionality. Now, standard network devices can be classified by the OSI layer at which they function. The OSI model, as we know, deals with 7 different layers of materials. So we break these networking steps down into the 7 layers and identify the cooperative tasks of adjacent layers and the specific networking tasks for each individual layer. The security functions of network devices can provide a degree of security, but again, must be configured properly so that we don't introduce vulnerabilities. So I talked about switches and routers a second ago, but we also have things like bridges, load balancers, and proxies. These can also be devices that can help us to improve security. Bridges are either hardware devices or software that joins 2 separate computer networks to enable communication between them. Kind of like when we talk about trunk ports in VLAN study, when we get into Net 126. We can connect 2 local area networks or 2 segments or subnets together by using a bridge. This is going to operate at data link layer 2. So the data link, of course, being one above physical. So that way we go above the cabling, and we're going to go ahead and get just below the network layer, layer 3. So all networks or segments that are connected must use the same layer 2 protocol. In this case, we're going to primarily talk about Ethernet 2, which is the current standard. Most operating systems allow for a bridge to connect 2 segments via software, but when we work with a software bridge, we could possibly create a vulnerability. Remember that when we create a software bridge, we're actually instantiating a segment between 2 physical networks using a privatized link in a way. And if that link is manipulated, corrupted, or interfered with, that can create some concealed potential for danger. Switches are devices that connect network hosts intelligently. Now, intelligence is kind of a difficult term. Remember that intelligence is not the same thing as sapience. Sapience is what people possess that makes them self-aware about their environment and can react, in most terms, spontaneously. Intelligence basically just means that we're able to take a particular set of input and use it to produce a beneficial output. It can learn devices that are connected to each of its ports, so we can use the MAC address of frames that are received and then associate it with the port. So we can associate ports, MAC addresses, and IP addresses in order to accelerate the speed at which data is able to be transmitted securely. If we know what MAC address a port belongs to, then we can make sure that it is not accidentally broadcasted anywhere else and that we're not wasting bandwidth and trying to figure out where it goes. We can also use things like sticky ports or sticky MACs on a Cisco device in order to make sure that a particular port is only going to accept traffic from the MAC that it is prescribed to be attached to. Now, switches are going to forward frames intended for a particular device in unicast mode as opposed to sending it all out as broadcast mode. It's important for switches to be properly configured, as it is for all network devices, in order to provide a high degree of security. Proper configuration means that we have to include loop prevention and provide some method of a flood guard. When we talk about floods, we're often going to talk about either broadcast floods or synchronization floods, and then there's also something called a broadcast storm, which can create a loop that we would try and avoid with loop prevention. The flood guard is just going to be, like you can see here, a broadcast storm establishment. We can see that we have 2 computers, alpha and beta, and we have 3 segments linking them by means of 3 separate switches. Threat agents may attempt a flooding attack by overflowing a switch on the link with a barrage of Ethernet frames that have been spoofed so that each frame contains a different source MAC address. So what this does is the switch essentially is constantly getting new frames, and the ARP table keeps changing, or MAC table keeps changing, and is unable to corroborate whether or not a particular address belongs to a particular port. So that means that new information coming through will sometimes be sent into kind of an overflow section, which can breach certain aspects of security. How do we defend against this? A flood guard, using port security in order to limit the number of MAC addresses that can be learned on a particular port in a particular window of time. So essentially, like anything else, we're just taking the theoretical maximum, which we presented by the hardware, and backing it down to something that's much more manageable by the software. Routers, these are going to forward packets across different computer networks. So switches deal with internal traffic, routers deal with external traffic. If we talk about SOHO routers, those are traditionally going to involve the switch capabilities of a switch in terms of routing local, as well as the routing capabilities of external traffic. Now, routers operate at layer 3, so we're talking about above the data link layer, above a bridge. They can be set to filter out specific types of traffic by using an ACL. More fully, what's called an access control list identifies who has access to what and what their permissions are. And we can also use this to limit traffic entering the network from an unapproved source. Load balancers help evenly distribute work across a network and allocate requests among multiple devices. So as I had a discussion with one of my students yesterday, would you try and drive your car if it only had 3 of its 4 tires? Probably not, because your car is built to be specifically balanced across the number of tires it was built for. If your tire was built for 3 wheels, or a car was built for 3 wheels, it would be perfectly fine, because that's how the car is weighted and axled. But if you don't do that, and you're trying to run your car on just 3 wheels, unless you're very, very good at feathering the wheel just far enough to keep the other axle off the ground and have all the weight on the side where the wheel is, you're going to be grinding the side of your car into the street. It's going to make a heck of a noise. So that's something that I would avoid. Load balancers, to herniate this analogy even further, are just those extra wheels trying to make sure that we balance a more rigorous load. If you're talking about like an 18-wheeler, obviously that's a lot more weight being shifted, so we need to make sure that there's more wheels to carry it. Load balancing technology is going to reduce that probability of overload and help to optimize bandwidth. You can also relate it to working in a striping configuration for RAID 0, to where essentially each hard drive that's involved is going to be doing 1 over n of the number of disk operations. So if we have 4 hard drives, each one is going to do 1/4 of the work, which theoretically should extend its lifespan by a factor of 4. Now this is obviously not a full linear transition. Age and other factors do tend to slow down drives well before their proper maximum, but again, we're trying to expand that lifespan. We're trying to stretch it out a little bit further before the mean time between failure kicks back in. Load balancing is achieved through either a software program or a hardware device. And we group these into 2 categories. Layer 4, transport layer protocols, are going to act on layers 3 and 4. Layer 7, or an application load balancer, is going to distribute requests based on data found in layer 7. Now there are some different scheduling protocols used in load balancers, one of which is used primarily for CPUs. And that's the round robin approach, where you're able to transition from one unit to the next after a predefined series of time. And then you also have affinity, and there's a couple of the other protocols as well. Proxies. Proxy is basically just something that acts on behalf of something else. So in computer networking, we have a ton of different proxies that are out there. Forward proxies are computers or application programs that intercept requests from the internal network and will process it on behalf of that user. This can act as a form of concealment, or this can act as a form of security by trying to protect the originator of a particular request. Application or multi-purpose proxies are special servers that know the protocols that it supports. Essentially, it's pre-identified, and then it's able to handle specific requests based on those rules. Reverse proxies are going to handle requests coming from an external network to the correct internal server. So you can see here in the graphic on the right, the forward proxy server is internal, the reverse proxy server is external and can help to route traffic to keep it from being overwhelmed and preventing the originator, again, from being the subject of the attack. It's kind of a sacrificial thing. I'd rather somebody hit my proxy server, which is much easier to reboot, than to hit my mainframe, that sort of thing. Transparent proxies, these don't require any kind of configuration on the user's computer. It's more of kind of a pass-through thing, but it is going to have a secondary network interface that's going to route traffic for the originator. Now, why do we use proxies? It's slightly faster. Again, we're adding more processing power to the same request. Reduced cost. Now, this is not reduced initial cost, but it will be reduced cost in terms of having to beef up a particular interface to be able to handle a substantial amount of traffic. It's easier to have multiple, less powerful devices that are fielding these requests because, again, internet requests are not large. SMTP for mail or POP or IMAP for outbound, and then you've got SNMP, the message protocol. You've got ICMP messages, you've got TCP and IP, DNS stuff floating around all the time. All these requests are relatively small. So this means that it's just a matter of having multiple interfaces to be able to process them. So that's really where the speed and cost transition comes in. It does cost more money initially to set them up because you have a lot more machines, but they're cheaper to maintain, cheaper to replace, and they're going to have that distribution factor, the load balancing factor, that is very handy for a much more economical way to maintain your network. A lot more improved management. Again, if we have multiple operators, we can designate one to handle a particularly odious task that we don't want everything to be exposed to, or we can have one that fields traffic from a particular client that uses a lot of information, throw some extra RAM in there, maybe a higher gig NIC, and being able to transfer that information more efficaciously. And stronger security. Any operator in the security environment will tell you compartmentalization is really handy. If you can block something into pieces, perform network segmentation, if you will, that allows you to secure more privileged assets by hiding them behind less privileged assets. It's the same principle behind a honeypot. You want somebody to go after the easy target that has something in it that they think might be valuable versus something that's harder to get to that probably is valuable. Now, hardware, of course, is going to often provide greater protection versus the standard if it is specifically designed, something that is priority designed for a particular function. Firewalls are a great example. Firewalls can be hardware-based or software-based. Both of them are going to inspect network traffic and either accept or deny entry based on a set of pre-configured rules. Now, hardware firewalls tend to be more expensive, as standalone devices are, and they're a little bit more difficult to configure and manage. This isn't necessarily saying that it's difficult on an absolute scale, but on a relative scale as opposed to a software firewall where everything's pre-configured and it's pretty easy to go ahead and add a rule or modify one. All modern operating systems include a software firewall, usually called a host-based firewall. So Windows, of course, has a Windows firewall. Linux has their own, port security stuff that goes on. Mac has their firewall, etc. So here we can see some examples of this. The personal Windows firewall on the left, based on whether or not you're on a public or private network. If you're on a domain, that might be different. The Juniper switch you see on the upper right is an enterprise level firewall. That's going to have a stronger measure of complexity than a standard switch in that it's going to be able to process traffic intelligently. Again, it's going to be able to look at the traffic as it's coming in, identify what protocols and traffic types it's handling, and be able to filter it accordingly. And then on the bottom right, we have just a standard topographical map of a network firewall where you can see the internet comes to the router. Of course, that's our primary external interface. And then we have our internal firewall here saying, okay, anything that comes in, I am going to process before it goes to the switch and before it goes to the server. Here's the real trick. Unlike things that are running through like network address translation, you can get errors with double NAT. There is no error that I have seen with correctly configured multiple layers. So if you have a router that has intelligent blocking capabilities, a firewall that has intelligent blocking capabilities, and switches and servers that have the ability to filter traffic or authenticate it correctly, then obviously you are going to have a much better time. Now, network-based firewalls will traditionally come into one of two flavors in terms of how they filter. Stateless packet filtering is where you inspect the packet and permit or deny based on conditions. So there's going to be a set of rules that are going to be there for inspection. Stateful filtering is going to keep a record of the state of the connection itself, and not only based on conditions, but that connection will then make a decision. So again, this moves further towards an intelligent decision-making process where it's able to take in multiple forms of observable information about the transmission and the connection on which it exists. Now, the firewall will traditionally take one of three actions: allow a packet through, drop it, or reject it. Now, dropping and rejecting have the same end result for the recipient, but the sender will either get no message, which is a drop, or get a message of rejection for reject. So essentially, if you send something and it doesn't go through and you get no message, that's a drop. If you get a message, it's rejection. Rule-based firewalls use a set of individual instructions to control actions, in which each rule is a separate instruction processed in sequence. I want to emphasize in sequence here because it's important to understand if you set up your rules to where there is a more restrictive rule that processes first, you will get to know more quickly, but you may accidentally exclude traffic that you meant to allow in. So make sure you're paying attention to how those rules are sequenced. Rules are stored together in one or more text files that are read when the firewall starts, and these rule-based systems are static in nature. They are not dynamic. They do not have the ability to change based on their inputs other than what they have been configured to do. Now, I'm sure there are some more experimental systems like this, but those tend to be built on a slightly different platform. Application-aware firewalls identify applications as opposed to worrying about rules or connections or whatever else, and then make a decision about what actions to take. Applications can be identified through application signatures, header inspection, payload analysis, port numbers. All of those things are entirely up for grabs. Web application firewalls, these are specific variations here of the application-aware firewall. They look more deeply into packets that carry HTTP traffic. Because HTTP packets are standardized, it can actually analyze certain aspects of it, like what flags are set, things of that nature. So that means that particular sites and particular types of traffic can be filtered. VPNs, virtual private networks, we use them all the time. These enable users to use an unsecured public network as if it were secure. So when you see guys and gals going into a Starbucks and they go ahead and sit down and they start working on something that looks complicated, private, whatever else, shouldn't be shoulder surfing, you snoop. More often than not, most companies will only authorize access of private information if you're using a VPN, meaning that there is an encryption sequence that goes between that remote device and the home network, usually using what's called tunneling to be able to process this. Now, there are three primary types of VPNs. Of course, there are some other variants, but these are the three big ones we're going to worry about. Remote access, which is user to LAN. Site to site, which is where sites can connect to one another over the internet. So this means that the physical access point is still on site, but the connection between them has to be encrypted, usually what's called pipelining at that point. Always on VPNs allow users to stay connected wherever they go. So essentially, as it shifts from network to network, the network connection between the remote device and the LAN that it's trying to get to, so the thing we see in remote access, is going to continually be shifting. And usually that means that there has to be a higher level of encryption key or something else being exchanged in order to provide that authentication as we move. Endpoints, these are going to be the end of the tunnel between VPN devices, so the VPN server on site and then the remote user. There may be software on the local computer or what's called a VPN concentrator. The concentrator is a dedicated hardware device that aggregates hundreds of thousands of VPN connections. And this is how a larger network is able to handle all of these connections and not be overrun while they're still handling all their normal business. Because again, they have a dedicated component that specifically handles this type of traffic. So if you had a particular server or switch rather, external router and switch combo that handled just FTP, for instance, that would be a great example. If you had one that just handled DNS, that would be a good example. Now, when we're using a VPN, there's two options. We can either do what's called a full tunnel, which is where all traffic gets sent to the VPN concentrator and protected, or we can have some traffic that's split one to the other. So only some traffic may be being routed through an application or a browser that has a particular encrypted profile, and then other traffic is directly accessing the internet as if it were a standard connection. This is called split tunneling. Now, split tunneling is more so for using things that are protected, being on site but not necessarily, top secret or, of the same. Like if I need to download a form from the HR department, it's only accessible through the school intranet. I could use my VPN connection to log into that, but I'm still, I've got Wired or Gizmodo or whatever else in my other tabs, and that can go through whatever traffic I want. I could do that on my phone through a standard cellular connection. So that type of item is where split tunneling is acceptable. If we're logging in through a client-based application that needs to be authenticated, that traffic would all be filtered specifically through that and probably into a concentrator. Again, full tunnel. I have IT clients I've worked for in the past who work in the banking industry, and that is very much how they operate. They have a Pulse Secure profile or something similar that they use, maybe a Global Protect or WireGuard. And it specifically filters traffic from that application based on a port number directly through full tunneling on that particular connection. Now, split tunneling is allowed, but it tends to cause problems, so they don't always use that secondary profile. Mail, of course, mail gateways. These can be standalone content holders, if you will. They can monitor email for unwanted content or prevent them from being delivered. There are two different email systems that we deal with. POP and SMTP, that's the simple send and receive. And then IMAP is a little bit more advanced, and that deals with transitions to a mail server online and is not downloaded locally. So if you used Outlook or Thunderbird, any of those desktop applications that downloaded your email for you, especially back in the dial-up days, that dealt with SMTP for sending and POP for receiving. IMAP just deals with communication with that remote server so that way everything stays on one storage location. Inbound emails can be implemented with a mail gateway to look for malware, spam, phishing, and outbound email can look for certain types of signatures to make sure that sensitive data is not sent. It can also make sure that people aren't trying to send information that should be protected in an unprotected form. It can make sure that things like zip files aren't being sent because those can be easily compromised, things like that. Lots of filtration that goes on there. Network intrusion detection and prevention. So NIDS and NIPS, or HIDS and HIPS if we're talking about host-based. But NIDS and NIPS deals with a intrusion protection or detection or prevention system on the network. So that covers all of the devices on. Intrusion detection can detect an attack as it occurs. An inline IDS will monitor flow as it's coming in and it's connected directly in. Passive IDSs are a little bit different. Those are hooked into a port and then receive a copy of the traffic that comes in. IDS systems can be managed either in band, meaning through the network itself, or out of band using a dedicated remote channel to reach the device. So we can see here from the graphic, inline versus passive, how they're connected, how the traffic flow works, what type of blocking can occur, and whether or not detection errors will disrupt service or cause false alarms. So of course you're going to play a little bit of cost benefit. Monitoring methodologies tend to fall into four primary categories: anomaly-based, signature-based, behavior-based, and heuristic. Anomaly-based looks at a particular baseline, which would have to be established before the monitoring would be most effective. Signature monitoring is going to look for known patterns. Behavior-based is going to look for abnormal actions based on, again, a baseline in terms of behavior applications that run. And if a user is found to be in violation of this behavior-based monitoring, a pop-up will be shown to make sure that they are aware that there is a potential problem with their current course of action. Heuristic monitoring is going to use combinations of the previous three and conforms them based on what are called experience-based schema. It's going to essentially observe potential problems, it's going to observe signatures, it's going to observe performance baselines versus spikes, and try and find intelligent means of comparison between baseline and potential danger. Heuristics monitoring is observationally based. Now, if we're talking about intrusion detection system types, we've got network intrusion, we also have host, as I said. This is going to be able to detect attacks as they occur, and they're on each system inside the network. So if we go all the way back to CTI 120, we talk about how we need not only perimeter security, but per host security. Every man, woman, and child inside of a castle should be provided the means to defend themselves so that if the main gate goes down, they're not left defenseless, right? The monitor can recognize system calls, file system access, unauthorized registry modification, host input and output communications, and trying to detect, again, anomalous activity. And a lot of this base activity must be established by means of a particular period of time of observation. What is considered normal? What is considered abnormal? And that requires a little bit more time and finesse. HIDS is a little bit resource intensive. It's a little hungry, again, because it's running on every system inside the network. Log data is stored locally, which means that if that particular system is compromised, it's difficult to follow the logs with any degree of accuracy. And we can't monitor network traffic that doesn't reach the local system, so that's why we would need the NIDS instead. The NIDS is going to look for just attacks on the network. We have sensors that are installed on firewalls and routers that report back and can sound alarms and log events. There are also variations of the NIDS called application aware. This is where we use contextual knowledge in real time to check an application, to check an OS version, to be able to identify what vulnerabilities may be present based on versions, and try and deal with responses based on that. Prevention systems are in a more aggressive form. Detection just says, hey, something's going on, we're going to let you know. NIPS devices are located in line. They are much more rapid fire in terms of taking action to block an attack. And then there are application versions aware of traffic types as well. Again, what application's running, what type of OS, and what vulnerabilities may be in place. Why do we need both? You know, prevention and detection. Well, there may be situations where you want to observe a potential attack, but still be able to prevent it from getting to something more secure. Again, that layer, that defense in depth. If we have the detection system on the exterior and the prevention system on the interior, that means, hey, we know an attack's coming through, we can have an alert, and then the prevention system can say, yep, you've gotten this far, but no further. You know, it allows us to see where there might be holes in the old fencing, if you will. We can also use a type of tool called an SIEM, Security and Information Event Management Tool. SIEM consolidates all real-time monitoring and management of security information into a single dashboard. And this way we can see graphical representation, textual information, reports, things like that. SIEM can be run as a separate device. It can be run as software on a local computer, or it can be a cloud-based service provided by a third party that's observed through a dongle or other software piece that runs on the network. SIEM traditionally has the following items included as part of its toolkit: aggregation, collecting data; correlation, finding links; automated alerting and triggers, self-explanatory; time synchronization; event duplication. You know, we can go through and we can duplicate the steps of what happened during a particular event in order to see where the point of breach actually occurred, where the vulnerability actually exists. And then, of course, logging. No good network security system worth its salt. Any device that's specialized for network security will not, they'll never leave out the logs. That's just a silly idea. So let's look at some other devices that we might see. Hardware security modules, of course, provides protection for our cryptographic keys. SSL decryptor. This is going to handle decryption of SSL traffic separately from the standard hardware or software that we would have for a host device or a switch, etc. TLS SSL accelerators. These are hardware cards that would insert into a web server or a hardware-based firewall that contains a coprocessor to handle specifically SSL and TLS processing. So because SSL is computationally intensive, the handshake requires a lot of key generation that would use 3DES or AES. Those things can be added in as part of like an eWIC model or something similar for your switch or server to enhance that performance. Media gateway. This is where we have a device that converts media from one format to another, sometimes called a soft switch. It will convert data from audio and video format to standardize. So that way, you know, if we have an HTML5 system, we can make sure that not only is the protocol going to be able to standardize things, but the transition moving over one switch or one other device is going to be standardized as well. UTM, Unified Threat Management Device. This combines several functions, so anti-spam, anti-phish, anti-spyware, encryption, intrusion protection, and web filtering. Internet content filters. These traditionally are software-based, but there are some standalone hardware ones that are out there. These will monitor internet traffic and block access to selected sites and files. It can restrict unapproved websites based on the URL, or it can do it based on keywords, as well as looking at malware. Web Security Gateway. This is going to block content in real time as it appears without first knowing the URL of a dangerous site. Again, this is going to involve some more contextual observation of the content, usually through application level filtering. The design of a network can provide a secure foundation for resisting attackers. And as I tell people all the time, security can't wait till the very end. You have to put it in from the beginning. So this means that design must include creating zones and means of segregation to compartmentalize the network into more secure pieces. A more secure approach is to create zones to partition the network so that users can move from one to the next if they are authorized. If they don't have access, obviously that access is prohibited. The most common zones would be either using demilitarized zones, which are basically gaps between firewalls, or network address translation to create software-based IP zones. The DMZ, or demilitarized zone, is a separate network located outside the secure network perimeter. Basically, the inner firewall of the DMZ creates the secure network perimeter, and that is going to allow separation between an external source and an internal source that would require some kind of filtering. Trusted outside users can get into the DMZ, but not the secure network. So even if you're authorized, but you're untrusted, you can get into a portion of this through brute force, but you can't get through both. Again, that's kind of why we talk about the difference between intrusion detection versus intrusion prevention. Network address translation, or NAT, allows us to translate private IP addresses internally to be used on the internet at large. So this is a good thing because it allows us to mask our internal devices' IPs, and we can't determine where the actual IP of the address sender came from. Now, for a home user, they can tell where your cable modem is, but they can't tell the actual IP address of your physical computer or tablet or phone. You can see in the graphic there the aliasing process that goes from sender IP private to sender IP public. Other zones we may deal with would be things like an intranet, extranet, or guest network. Intranet is internal only. Extranet is a middling zone between a private network and a zone that is specifically designed for external partners. And then open networks are guest networks rather are open and anyone can access them without prior authorization. Usually just kind of a generic password would be present. So if you go to the library, the aquarium, Starbucks, these are guest networks. So you can access general resources, but not necessarily anything that's considered internal or private. Network segregation can be done based on software, or we can have physical segregation where we isolate the network to prevent it from being accessible by outsiders. This is sometimes called air gapping. An air gap is the absence of any type of connection between devices, be it wireless or wired. In this case, secure networks and non-secures. Networks can be segmented using switches to divide the network into a hierarchy as well. You'll develop something called a core versus workgroup setting. Core switches would be at the top and carry traffic between themselves, and then workgroup switches are directly connected to devices on the network, meaning again an extra level of processing, which is an extra possibility for filtration and prevention of negative traffic on the network. Virtual LAN or VLAN allows scattered users to logically be grouped together even if they're attached to separate switches. So if we have a management interface and we need it to be available across platforms at multiple sites, we can use VLANs to be able to create that secured environment, and we can isolate sensitive data to just members of that VLAN or virtual LAN. Communication operates like this. If it's connected to the same switch, the switch handles the packet transfer, and there's a special tagging protocol that passes it from switch to switch. Now, there are things like double tagging manipulations that can be employed to break this, but in general, if we configure it correctly, VLANs are very, very secure, especially when combined with things like VPNs. Some other things that we can use to secure network traffic would be network access control and data loss prevention, so NAC and DLP. You know we love an acronym. NAC is where we examine the current state of a system or device before it can connect. Any device that doesn't meet this particular set of criteria can connect only to a quarantine network where we can then correct our deficiencies. So we see here in the graphic, System Health Agent does a self-assessment. The statement of health is sent to the registration authority. The registration authority is attached to an antivirus and patch management server. The health certificate is issued to the client. If there is no health certificate or the health certificate comes back with a negative response, it moves into the quarantine network where we can run antivirus, where we can run patch management, things like that. If the health certificate is positive, we are then able to be presented to the network server and allowed access. So this is any device trying to connect, be it phone, tablet, desktop, laptop, still has to go through the same process. So that means that it has to be SHA compliant or NAC compliant to be able to get into the network at all. Even if the device is perfectly safe, which is a very dangerous statement to make, if it is not able to process the statement of health certificate through the authority, it will not be allowed to connect. The goal of NAC is to prevent computers with suboptimal security from potentially infecting other computers throughout the network. NAC will use software agents to gather information and report back. Agents may be either permanent or dissolvable. Dissolvable agents will disappear after reporting information, so they're temporary. NAC technology can be embedded within a Microsoft Windows AD controller. NAC will then use the AD to scan the device. This is called agentless NAC because it's using Active Directory materials in order to perform the scan. DLP is a series of tools that are used to recognize and identify data critical to the organization and ensure it is protected. Two common uses would be monitoring emails using the mail gateway we talked about earlier, and then what's called USB blocking, preventing copying of files to a flash drive. Most DLP systems use content inspection, which is defined as a security analysis of the transaction within its approved context, meaning that if this transaction were occurring and it were all above board, would it follow steps A, B, and C? If we can compare it to this transaction and those steps match, seems good. If not, then we throw up an alert. Content inspection doesn't only look at the security level of the data, but it also looks at the requesting user, the storage location, when it was requested, and where it's going. So we can identify both directions on a single channel, as well as the originator of the request and the time in which that request was placed. There are three different types of DLP sensors: network, storage, and agent. When a policy violation is detected by the agent, it passes back to the DLP server, and then actions can be taken based on, again, the criteria that has been observed thus far: blocking the data, requesting a manual inspection, quarantine, and then alerting supervisors. All of these can be carried out very easily. And that is the chapter, everybody. So hopefully you feel a little bit more comfortable with security in network design. If you have any questions or concerns, as always, you can message me directly through Google Hangouts. You can email me, you can contact me with my Google Voice number, or you can leave a comment here on the old YouTube page. Have any ways in which I could do something a little bit better, or of course a subject I could clarify, I'm always glad to hear it. Always be learning, always be trying to find ways to improve, because believe me, I don't consider myself to be perfect by a long road, and the second you stop trying is the second that you stop succeeding. So keep it up, keep working hard. Be sure to let me know if you have any questions, and I thank you again for your time and attention. As always, guys, I appreciate you, and I will see you next class.